down on that wacky jig. Yeah. Woo-hoo-hoo. Look at that guy pull, will you? Yeah, look at that guy pull. Now we're totally different than what we were this morning. We're out here fishing 12 and 13 foot deep, out in front of where we were fishing at daylight this morning, and catching a lot of fish. Come here, baby. And this little rig that I've got on there now is a Wacky rig, but I've got a 16th ounce sinker on there, a 16th ounce jig. It's not a sinker, it's a jig. It's a weedless jig. It's a jig that Northland Tackle makes. And what it's made for, it's that right there, it's made for bass. But what it's made for, let me show you. And I've got a Lucky Strike sinking worm on there. I've got a little split ring on there so I don't lose my worm. This is a 16th ounce. You see these two little weed guards right there? This is made where you can fish it down in brush. Fishing a Wacky rig where you got a worm hooked in the middle like I have right there, that's just a sinking worm. I got it hooked in the middle, and I've got a split ring on it. That way you got the split ring so you don't lose so many worms. You can catch quite a few fish on one worm. And that's made where you can get it down in the brush around logs and sticks and stuff, and it's protecting that hook. And it's made to fish deep, and they've got them in a lot of different sizes, and they've actually got them in some pretty heavy sizes where if you want to fish a Wacky rig down 10, 15, 20 foot deep, something like that, you can, which is something we've not really been able to do too well. But now you can, and not only can you fish it deep, you can fish it in brush. So it's a whole new little trick out there to catching fish on a plastic worm. Deep fishing a Wacky rig. Don't know how big he is. I'm fixing to find out. He doesn't feel like he's a very big one. Nah, just a nice little Wacky worm fish. That's the other thing that will happen as you get into later in the day with the sun getting higher and the bite getting tougher, is the fish generally will get a little bit smaller. Now, that doesn't mean you can't catch a 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 pound fish in the middle of the day, because I've done that a lot. But overall, just as a general rule of thumb, as you get past that early morning bite, you fish generally get a little bit smaller. They get more difficult to catch, and they're not quite as large. You notice the fish we're catching on a worm are not quite as big as what we were catching earlier this morning on a spinnerbait and a deep smoothie. But it's probably, again, was time of day as opposed to the bait. It's probably just time of day. Probably could have fished the worm in there this morning. One of the reasons you want to fish a little bit faster moving bait like a crankbait or a worm early in the morning is if that bite's going, you want to cover a lot of water. You want to get to the fish as quickly as you can. And if you're fishing slow, you're going to cover a lot less water and probably have some fish out there that you just simply didn't get your bait in front of while they were biting.